What if two countries with almost none of the natural resources we associate with wealth became economic giants? Look closely at the map. Japan is a mountainous island nation while South Korea occupies only part of a much larger peninsula. That geography created a problem from the beginning. There simply was not enough land, energy, or raw material to build an economy the easy way. Yet today, Japan is home to Toyota, Sony, and Nintendo, while South Korea gave the world Samsung and Hyundai. But here's the part that makes the story extraordinary. Neither country started from a position of comfort. To understand that transformation, we have to go back to the middle of the 20th century when Japan and South Korea were facing very different but equally difficult realities. For Japan, the war had ended in defeat and occupation. For Korea, liberation from Japan did not bring immediate unity. Instead, the peninsula was divided. Then came the Korean War. Between 1950 and 1953, the peninsula was devastated, and South Korea emerged from the conflict extraordinarily poor. Japan, meanwhile, had something South Korea did not, an industrial base that could be rebuilt, reorganized, and connected to a rapidly changing global economy. And then something unexpected happened. The Korean War created enormous demand for supplies, equipments, and manufactured goods across the region. But the Korean War alone cannot explain Japan's rise. The deeper story was what Japanese companies did with that opportunity. Japan increasingly competed not by having more resources but by using fewer resources more efficiently and turning engineering discipline and manufacturing into competitive advantages. South Korea's story was different. It had to build much of its industrial base after the Korean War under a government determined to transform a poor country into an export economy. This was the beginning of South Korea's famous export driven transformation: steel, ships, car, electronics, and eventually semiconductors. And here is the bigger pattern: Japan and South Korea did not become wealthy by discovering huge reserves of oil or minerals. They built wealth by becoming exceptionally good at producing things the world wanted to buy. But this raises an even bigger question. If exporting manufactured goods was the answer, why did some countries succeed at it while others did not? One of the most important pieces of the puzzle was education. Both countries invested heavily in creating a workforce capable of learning, adapting, and eventually innovating. The idea was simple but powerful. A country without abundant natural resources could still become rich if its people became the resources. But educated workers needed somewhere to work, and this is where government policy became crucial, especially in South Korea. The government pushed selected industries, provided support and credit, and encouraged companies to compete in international markets. That strategy helped create something that would become central to South Korea's economy. The Chaebol large family controlled business groups built into global industrial giants. Japan followed a different corporate path. Large companies were connected through networks of banks, suppliers, and manufacturers, often described through the system of Kitsu. The structure was different, but the destination was similar. Build domestic capabilities, scale production, improve quality, and sell to the world. And the result was dramatic. Japan became one of the world's largest economies, while South Korea moved from extreme poverty toward the ranks of high income economies within just a few generations. But there is a catch. This transformation came with enormous pressure, long working hours, intense competition, inequality, environmental costs, and period of financial crisis. Japan's success eventually created a new problem. By the late 1980s, confidence had turned into excess and asset prices exploded. Then the bubble burst. Stock and land prices collapsed. Banks were left with bad loans and Japan entered years of painfully slow growth. South Korea faced its own crisis a few years later. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis exposed serious weaknesses inside its financial and corporate system. The crisis forced painful reforms. Companies were restructured, weaker businesses disappeared, and Korean firms became even more focused on global competitiveness. And this is where the story changes. The goal was no longer simply to make cheap products, it was to move higher up the value chain. Japan became known for automobiles, machinery, cameras, and precision electronics. South Korea increasingly dominated memory chips, displays, ships, automobiles, and consumer electronics. But technology does not appear out of nowhere. It comes from decades of research, engineering, investment, and the ability to learn from the rest of the world. And because their domestic market was relatively limited, both countries had another choice compete beyond their borders. That meant something unusual for countries with limited natural resources. They could import raw materials, transform them into higher value products, and export those products at a much greater value. That is the core of the story. Their natural resource disadvantage did not disappear. Instead, their economies learned to turn knowledge, labor, and technology into value. But there is a one mistake we should avoid. Looking at Japan and South Korea today, it's tempting to think their success was simply about working hard. Behind the factories were roads, ports, electricity, schools, financial institutions, and governments capable of coordinating long term development. Geography also played a role. Both countries were positioned next to major Asian markets, while their coastal geography made maritime trade especially important. And there was another factor access to the world's biggest consumer markets. Japanese and Korean companies could sell increasingly sophisticated products abroad, but their story cannot simply be copied. Japan and South Korea benefited from a very specific historical movement and from circumstances that may not exist in the same way today. Today, a developing country entering manufacturing faces competition from China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, India, and many others. Automation has also changed the equation. Cheap labor alone is no longer enough when machines can perform more and more tasks. So, the lesson from Japan and South Korea is not simply manufacture more, it is to continuously move toward skills, technology, productivity, and higher value industries. And perhaps the most important lesson is that economic development is not one giant leap. It is thousands of improvements made consistently over decades. Japan and South Korea did not become rich because they discovered a secret resources hidden beneath their soil. They built an economy around something much harder to exhaust. But Japan and South Korea did not follow exactly the same road. Their economic models, political systems, and corporate structures were different. Japan's rise began earlier, building on industrial capabilities that existed before the post war period. South Korea's transformation came later and much faster. And both models had serious weaknesses. Rapid industrialization created inequality, environmental damage, labor pressures, and dependence on exports. And today, both countries face a new challenge. How do you stay rich when the very model that made you rich is changing? Because today's competition is no longer just about factories, it is about semiconductors, artificial intelligence, advanced materials, robotic energy, and ideas. So, did Japan and South Korea become rich despite having few natural resources? In one sense, yes, but that's only half the answer. The real resource was built in classrooms, laboratories, factories, ports, and institutions. They turned knowledge into productivity, productivity into competition, industries and competitive industries into exports. And perhaps that's the most important lesson. Natural resources can give a country wealth, but human capabilities determine what a country can build with it. Japan and South Korea did not find wealth beneath the ground. They built it above the ground, one generation, one factory, one invention, and one improvement at a time. And this is where Japan and South Korea become more than just economic success stories. They became a lesson in how a country can respond where nature does not give it an easy advantage. The deeper lesson is not that every country should become Japan or South Korea. It's that development has to build around the strengths a country can actually create, because the real question is not what resources does a country have. The better question is what can its people learn to do exceptionally well. Japan and South Korea show us that geography can create constraints, but institutions, education, technology, and human capabilities can change what those constraints mean. So, the next time you see Japan or South Korea on a map, don't just see two wealthy countries, see two experiments in turning limitations into capability and capability into power.